6 that I'm going to be, or on I6 that I'm looking at, what I needed for you to do is to tell me your beginning point for each one. So each one looking at the beginning. The only one that was kind of questionable would be this one, but here you should have been able to tell me your beginning, you should have been able to tell me your beginning point. So for those first two, you should have been able to give me that first point where it began. Then you also needed to use the 2 points that were on the graph, so I gave you 2 points on that, and we were looking at finding the rise over the run. And then your final answer was going to be y equals mx plus b, and you would have 2 numbers in these places. So when you were looking at your equation, that's probably where any of them, if you were looking at having problems or getting your equation, just making sure you're watching the scales as you look at those. But question number 6 over here is the one where when you looked at your points, you should have had a negative slope and then plus this number. If yours was not the same as the one in the back, that's okay. So I had some people having y equals negative 1x plus 15. I had some answers having negative 0.8x plus 12. I had some with y equals negative 0.75 or negative 3/4 x plus 13. Whatever equation yours was the one that you want to use to find the rest of the answers. So when you got down here, you were trying, you should have seen that x was your distance. So make sure you're labeling your graph. So that's going to be one of the things on the test, is that you label, this is our distance in feet. So if x in this case is equal to 6, you're going to use your equation that you wrote up here. You're going to write that here and find what y is, for the question was the number of center hits. So this was our center hits. And so you should get that number. Whereas in question 9, you are going to be looking at that y is equal to 4 hits. And you are going to be trying to find x. And again, you are going to use your equation that was written earlier. So whatever equation you have here is the equation that you are using to find both the x and the y as you take a look at this. Okay? So of the 14 questions, the first 9 are going to be that you can construct and interpret a scatter plot. That's what we just did on the I6. That's what you're going to be looking at on the I7 packet that I gave you, where you can construct and interpret the scatter plot. You are going to be asked to draw a line of best fit, so draw that trend line and make a prediction. When you're constructing it, this is going to be like the 6 points as you are looking at doing those constructions. And then it is going to be almost exactly like on I6, what we just looked at. You will have these questions like I6, 8, 9. So doing this problem, making sure you have this, and as you do I7, that you make sure that you really understand so those equations, so that when you know x equals a number like x equals 7, and then when y equals 4, how to solve for the other variable. So you want to make sure you understand how to do that solving. This 9 questions is going to be 46 points for that standard that we are looking at. So constructing the scatter plots, it's a lot like I6 and I7. So I6 and I7 is you are looking at making sure you do those types of questions. The next standard is that I can construct and interpret the two-way table. So this was a lot like that I4 project that you got back, and make relative frequencies. The key thing with relative frequencies on the project that some of you thought it was out of the total, so you divided everything by 15. So you want to make sure you understand that once you've made that two-way table, like where you had your chores, please quit, and no chores, and then you had the total back here, and then maybe you had allowance and no allowance. So when you were looking at making that table with your total, that you understand that if you are going across, that is a row relative frequency. So some of you thought on that project, you thought you were dividing by 15 the total, and you weren't. You should have been dividing by the totals at the end of the row. So if I'm looking at the totals at the end of the row, I'm trying to look at how many people got an allowance, how many did chores or didn't, how many that did not get an allowance, so row relative frequency, versus if it says to find the column relative frequency. Column is going to be going down. When you go down, and then the total would have been on our project where you divided by 15. So making sure you know how to interpret that. So that's going to be 18 points as you look at the final, or at the test. I'm going to put it in as out of 100%, but it is really out of 50 points. So, as you are looking at what's on the final, I can use the Pythagorean theorem to find the missing side. That is one question of 4 points. The next one, I can apply the exponent rules and properties to simplify. There will be 2 questions, 8 points. This final is going to be on Wednesday. So that is the 29th. The 30th is your last day of school. The 29th, the day before, is when we'll take this final. Okay. I can solve multi-step equations with rational coefficients. So that's solving the, like anytime you have an equation with variables on both sides and looking at solving that. So that's going to be 4 points. This next one, that I can construct a function to model the problem and interpret the m and the b. This would be one of those problems like they're filling the ice rink and they're filling it with so many gallons of water per hour, and the question's going to ask you what is the slope, and you say, oh, the slope was that they put in 20 gallons per hour, and the y-intercept, the b, was that it started at 0 at 0 times 0. So that is actually going to be 15 points because there's quite a few parts to that question. So it's going to be writing the equation, it's going to be making a graph of it, finding both the slope and y-intercept, and explaining it. And I'm going to show you in your review exactly the type of questions that all of these look like for both the tests. That's on the I-14 review that is due, and then the I-15 review, which is this part for the final. So I can compare properties of 2 different functions. When you are looking at those, that's going to be 4 points. So comparing the properties, that's like when you look at a table or a graph or an equation, which one has a bigger slope, a greater slope? Which one has a greater y-intercept? Okay, so those are kind of our key properties when we think of comparing those. Solving a linear system. And notice it says you can use any method when you're doing that, solving your linear system. This could be graphing, this could be elimination, or it could be substitution. This is where you are trying to find the x and the y. So when we're solving that linear system, usually it's the elimination or substitution. So that's where you're going to have the 2 equations where you have maybe like y equals 2x minus 3, and then you'll have another one where you have y equals 5x minus 7, and you're asked to solve those. So you're going to see some of those in the review that I'll show you. The last one is I can tell the story for a graph, and I can graph the story. Again, that one is going to be 5 points. That's where I maybe tell you that, like the bus when it was stopping, that was the one that was on the test. When we had the bus and it pulled away from the stop sign, and then it drove at a certain speed for so long, and then it came to a stop light, then it picked up passengers, and so you're telling the story by making that graph. And then the last one is I can write a sequence of transformations to prove that it is congruent. So like our last test, test H that we did, this will be 6 points. And this part will be when you are telling me more like the First we did, if it's congruent or similar, you're going to say the triangle was either congruent to the other triangle, or you're going to tell me that it was similar. So making sure you know the difference. Similar is when we have the size change. So when you're telling me what happened, you might say, well, first you were going to dilate. And you might say, depending if you started with the smaller one, you might say, I'm going to dilate it by 2. If you started with the larger one, you might use a half. Then you're going to tell me that next thing you did was either to rotate or translate or reflect. So it's going to be doing all of those type of ones, okay? If it was just congruent, you would have one of these, and you would not have the size change, right? There's no size change when you are talking about congruent figures. So when you get to the final, if you have two triangles or shapes that are different sizes, you definitely know that there had to be a size change and that they are similar or not congruent. If they're the exact same size, there cannot be a size change with a dilation. And you're just going to rotate, translate, and reflect. Some of you kind of forgot that the rotate, thinking 90 degrees when you are going clockwise versus 90 degrees when you are going counterclockwise versus the 180 where they just switch spots. So thinking about if you're reflecting again, if you go over the x-axis, what does that look like? Versus if you go over the y-axis, and you're going to see that there's going to be quite a few practice problems for you to take a look at. Okay?